Marilyn Sewell, who is another UU minister, writes in a sermon titled Radical Hospitality, "Hospitality is a word with a spiritual history, as a matter of fact. Monasteries grew up around the 5th century. Strangers in need would come there for care. The first primitive hospitals, in fact, began there. Hospital, hospice, hospitable, hospitality, they all come from the same root word, meaning generous, caring, sustaining." So the theme of welcoming the stranger and the religious obligation for hospitality in welcome is prevalent in all sorts of religious stories from all sorts of religions, but particularly strong in the Abrahamic traditions of Judaism, Christianity, or Islam, or at least those are the traditions I know best. We heard an Islamic story about welcome for our children's story. In the Jewish tradition, we see this in the Passover Seder, where an empty seat is always left open for Elijah, and in the Sodom and Gomorrah story, which is really a story about guest rights, and about how only Lot was willing to give the strangers welcome, and the villagers wanted him to send his guests out from his protection, and the visitors were really angels or envoys from God. Here's another story of hospitality from the Hindu tradition. Disguised as a wandering mendicant, Krishna visits a wealthy family who welcome him warmly and offer him hospitality that matches both their devotion and prosperity. When it is time to leave, he blesses the host profusely, promising him even more wealth and glory. Krishna's next visit is to a poor widow whose only possession is a cow. She too welcomes him with great devotion, but all that she can offer him is a glass of milk. When it is time to leave, Krishna blesses her and tells her her cow will die soon. Arjuna, the warrior who's accompanying Krishna to both places, is horrified. He asks Krishna, "Your wealthy hosts lack nothing, and you bless them with more wealth, whereas your blessing to the poor devotee accompanied the ominous news that she will lose her cow. This is unfair and unacceptable." Krishna smiles and tells Arjuna, "My wealthy host is insanely attached to his wealth and his reputation. He has a long way to go before he becomes spiritually awakened. On the other hand, this poor devotee is already far advanced on the spiritual path. The only thing that is separating her from the highest freedom is her attachment to that cow. I removed the hurdle from her path." So, a little bit different way of looking at religion than our Western traditions do, because attachment and the role of attachment in Hinduism and Buddhism is very different from our Western attachment to things. But we can see the idea that God can come in the form of a visitor, transcends culture, and is used as an example to tell all of us, essentially, that we should be welcoming to every stranger, because you never know when that stranger might be an angel or the Messiah or God. One of the reasons I love that speech by Lisa Cron that we heard earlier, and I'm not even sure she's aware of it, is that she's making a Christian biblical reference there. In talking about this dream of hers, this recurring dream that her house has more rooms than she's aware of, and using it as a metaphor for how we can include all kinds of people and all kinds of stories on Broadway, how we can celebrate and include a diversity of people in our home, she's making a biblical allusion at the same time. One famous passage in the Bible is from the book of John, chapter 13, where Jesus says, "I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." That's often used to say that, like, you have to be Christian in order to be going to heaven. But a few verses before that, Jesus says something that makes the statement so much more expansive. And without it, I don't really think you understand what Jesus is saying about going to the Father through him. Jesus says something that I think is at the heart of universalism. He says, "My Father's house has many rooms. If that were not so, would I have told you that I'm going there to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come back and take you with me, that you may also be where I am. You know the way to the place where I am going." Jesus is talking about radical welcome, I think, a welcoming of many faiths, of many types of people, of all types of people to his Father's house. So the path to the Father's house is through Jesus, and he will take us there, but he will take all of us there. So when he says there's no other way but through me, I think he's merely saying not that we can get to heaven only by believing in Jesus, but that we're all going to get to heaven in this way, and that's the way that Jesus will guide us through. He's talking about universalism. All are welcome, all are accepted, all are embraced, all are holy and worthy and good because his Father's house has many rooms, many rooms. Or as Lisa Cron says, you guys, our house is so big. Please let's not go back to just living in the living room. But when I heard Lisa Cron's words, I also thought about how our house of worship, has many rooms. And sometimes maybe we have been only living in the living room in our faith, or the dining room and kitchen, and not realizing that our faith is so much bigger than that. We have a religious obligation to understand that our house is bigger, our faith is expansive, and to welcome the stranger. Here's an example. Some of you may have read the most recent issue of the UU World, and there's an article in there by my friend Derek Jackson, who's a UU minister. Derek and I know each other, and I can tell you amazing things about him, including this thing. Derek was in a Klingon production of A Christmas Carol last year. That impresses me. I mean, not only can he act, but he can speak Klingon. Derek also happens to be an African American, which is relevant to this article, in which he talks about the ways that Unitarian Universalism hasn't been entirely welcoming to him and to his cultural heritage. He says this, which I love because it's a really concrete example. Quote, growing up in the AME church, I was presented with images of spirituality grounded in my Black identity. The worship service and religious education both referenced Black history and Black culture. I learned how my cultural struggle and my identity interfaced with the biblical narrative. When I became a Unitarian Universalist, it was clear that my history and my culture were not reflected in the worship and religious education. I could connect on the level of my humanity, but my identity was rarely represented except on special days, Martin Luther King Day, Black History Month, Kwanzaa. In those moments, I felt other. I felt that my culture was on display and not an inclusive part of the service. I read this and I wondered, how many worship services have I done where there was not a single reading or a single hymn or a single quote by a person of color? I am sure that services like that exist in my history because as a white person, my own culture is the culture I'm steeped in. And the cultural references I reach to, as I said most early, come from like the Western religious traditions more easily than the Eastern religious traditions. The cultural references I'm steeped in as a literature major are white, European, mostly British authors and American sources, white American sources for the most part. So there are times when the lack of welcome in our faith has to do with a lack of cultural sensitivity or a lack of multicultural awareness. But there are also times when we fail in our mandate for radical welcome because of reasons that are a little bit more difficult. Sometimes we don't want to change or be inconvenienced. We like the way things are. We don't want to do it differently, even if doing it differently might make us more welcoming to some people. Or we feel like an insider clique, essentially. Our church is what they call a family-sized church. And a family-sized church is called family-sized because it functions like a family sometimes. Here are some definitions of a family-sized church. A family-sized church often has a patriarch or matriarch, or sometimes several, a church elder or elders in whom much informal and sometimes formal power is placed, and what they say goes. When a family church fights, its fights look at best like family squabbles, and at worst like family feuds. And you get welcomed into a family-sized church by being adopted into the family. That last point is what I want to focus on. In a family-sized church, the membership model is adoption. And who do we tend to adopt? People who fit into the family. And the family is all more or less monocultural. It's harder here at this size to have differences at this church size. So we have this obstacle against us in our understanding that we are a house of many rooms. And it's okay if we don't use all these rooms all the times and we don't all each individually have to use all the rooms. Maybe you don't like the activity that that room is geared toward, or you don't like something about that room. But as a faith, as a whole, we have to become more expansive in our welcome. I gave you an example of how our church can be monocultural with Derek's words, and obviously it's not just us, because he's talking about his experience all over Unitarian Universalism. Here's another quote for him. As a worship leader, I've had difficulty finding UU resources for my services, particularly when dealing with issues of struggle, despair, grace, and hope. So diversifying our worship in content, theme, tone, and source is one way to become more welcoming. I wanted to give you another concrete example of a group where we could learn to become more welcoming. Children. Well, actually, children and parents. Now remember the adoption method. We adopt people who are most like us. But children, in many ways, are not like us. They are not just little adults in some ways. They are fundamentally different at times. They have different interests, different needs, different cultural touchstones. Like, a whole service geared around Paw Patrol might not be that interesting to you, but might be fantastic to our 3- and 4-year-olds. They have different energy levels, and they have different attentiveness levels. But they have a spiritual self, and they have a worshipful self, and this faith has lots of room for them, lots of rooms. I think our faith often says to African Americans, we want you here as long as you worship like we do, as long as you like our music and our poetry and our method of responding to a sermon, which is to say, to move or say very little, maybe nod your head, occasionally laugh, but no jumping up and down or arm waving. And we say the same thing in different ways to other groups, whether it's people who are differently abled, or LGBTQ people, or yes, also children. We say to them, we want you to worship like us, be mini adults. And we say to parents too, we want you to parent the way we parented. But here's an interesting thing. Parenting has changed a lot over the last century. The experience and expectations and perspectives of today, of parents today, may be as different from parents 50 years ago as the experience of different races are from one another. In an article from the New York Times, Lisa Belkin explains, citing a study from Martha Rutherford out of Wellesley. Belkin writes, her findings, today's children have more freedom inside the house, the right to express their opinions, the right to disagree with their parents, but less freedom outside the house, kept on a shorter leash, consistent with growing fears for children's safety. At the start of the last century, Rutherford states, the article continues, parenting advice columns stressed obedience by children to their parents. One 1929 article defined a parent's job as the reasonable regulation and supervision of the fundamental habits of a child throughout all the stages of his development, and a consistent plan for having him obey simple rules, such as regular meal times, regular bedtimes, training and elimination, eating what is placed before him, wearing the clothes that are provided, observing certain proprieties of conduct. Now, compare that advice from 1929 to advice she quotes from a more recent book on parenting. Provide choices. First, let your child know you understand why she's angry, then give her some control by letting her make a decision. One can almost guess where the turning point was between parenting focused on such things as obedience, respect for your elder, proper behavior, and then parenting focused on parents providing attention to the children, providing the best environment to nurture them, and helping them develop their identity first and foremost. It's almost as if the emphasis changed from the child's behavior to the parent's behavior. Parenting became a verb. And of course, you might guess that things shifted around the 1960s, as much of our culture did. It wasn't overnight. It wasn't before and after a magic date, of course. But that difference in parenting across generations, with older generations believing that children who behave and learn to sit quietly and worship and follow the rules of decorum is important, and Gen X and millennial parents who are interested in fostering creativity and wonder and extensive exploration, even if that means exploring the whole sanctuary. This generational division can be captured in so many areas across our worship and faith life. We've had church debates about the flag that break down very clearly across generations, and it's easy to understand that what the flag represents for a GI generation and silent generation who fought the world wars, their perspective on flag and country is going to be very different from the Vietnam generation who fought a very different war and had a very different relationship to the flag. So, to try to understand one another across generations also means to understand one another across cultures. As Christian Cleveland writes in Christianity Today, this is in an article titled 3 Reasons Why I Hate Diversity. She writes, in radically diverse churches, I can't control the environment. Heck, I can't even predict it. People might worship in ways that make me uncomfortable. People might interpret scripture in ways that I deem heretical. People might not be able to relate to my experience as a black woman. People might arrive too late or too early. People might hold perspectives that shatter my worldview. People might not laugh at my jokes. Who would want to attend a church like that? So this is hard work, and sometimes we don't like it. And I've done a lot of explaining about how it's hard, and how sometimes we're not the best at it. But I want to return to that idea that it's a religious mandate, that it's something our faith tells us to do, to welcome the stranger, to work to make ourselves radically welcoming, which means more inclusive and more understanding. I mean, there are lots of things we can do to become more welcoming as a church, and a lot of the lists you'll see online have things like ushers and greeters and clear signs and directions. But religious community at its core is about belonging, and about meeting that ancient imperative to welcome the stranger means making a community where all can belong. That's what I'm talking about when I say radical welcome. What I mean is sometimes we put aside our personal wants and needs in order to meet people where they are, to meet the stranger where they are, and establish things that make them comfortable, establish them as comfortable. Richard Rohr from the Center for Action and Contemplation talks about why we need diversity in religious communities, saying, diversity in community also helps us recognize our own selfish preferences for ease and comfort. If we're truly going to follow Jesus, the way will not be easier or popular. As Cleveland writes, he says, Jesus was so passionate about creating a diverse family with us that he crossed metaphysical planes, abdicated his privilege, morphed into physical form, and spent 30 years on earth just hanging out with us, knowing all the while, knowing that his pursuit of diversity would ultimately cost him his life. Observing nature, we see that diversity is essential to balance. He continues, wholeness and resilience. Ecosystems thrive when a variety of species of plants and animals nourish each other. The world is a relational system full of complex interdependence among very different creatures. If we want sustainable communities, we must always welcome the other and learn to see our neighbors as ourselves. I love that he puts the same concept into two different languages there, a religious Christian language and a humanist scientific language, and comes to the same conclusion that we need this radical diversity. When a parent walks in with a young child, when a member of a race different than your own or another culture, or when a person rolls in on wheels, or a person comes in who's clearly transgender, or wearing a hijab, or whatever the difference between you and them is, how do you bridge that gap and show radical welcome? Changing culture and becoming more open, more diverse, more accepting, it's not easy. There is no magic bullet. It takes work, it takes intention, it takes commitment and recommitment. But we must do it because our faith is so much broader, so much more welcoming than any one culture, than any one generation, than any one perspective, than any one religion. We have a universal faith, a faith that can embrace and love the whole of humanity and the whole of the world. One of our Universalist forebears said in 1943, universalism can not be limited to either Protestantism or to Christianity. Merge those two words there. But not without denying its very name. Ours is a world fellowship, not just a Christian sect. For long as universalism is universalism and not partialism, the fellowship bearing its name must succeed in making it unmistakably clear that all are welcome. Theist and humanist, Unitarian and Trinitarian, colored and coloredless, in his 1943 language. A circumscribed universalism is unthinkable. It's one of my favorite Universalist quotes because it talks about how large, how amazingly large our faith has the potential to be. It has the potential to be radically welcoming to the whole world if we just let it, if we don't stand in its way. We have to get over sometimes our particular desires about the way things should be done and the way things should be and embrace diversity. But as that article I quoted about hating diversity says, after she talks about Jesus spending his life in the pursuit of diversity, she says, it's this truth that compels me to get down on my knees, pray for the Holy Spirit's conviction, and ask myself hard questions about why I'm resistant to truly living in diverse community. What am I afraid of? How are my fears preventing me from experiencing the richness of the radically diverse family of God? And is God big enough to sustain me as I face my fears? Or, again, as Lisa Cron said, you guys, our house is so big. Please let's not just go back to the living room. May it be so.